September 12, 1944. A transport convoy rolled through the French countryside carrying an unusual cargo. 37 German women, members of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, sat in silence as American military trucks carried them toward an uncertain fate. They had been captured 3 days earlier near the Belgian border, their communications unit overrun during the Allied advance. Now they were prisoners of war, heading to a facility they knew nothing about, in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to fear above all others. Among them sat 21-year-old Margarete Hoffmann, a radio operator from Munich who had joined the auxiliary service in 1942. She clutched a small photograph of her younger brother Klaus, wondering if she would ever see him again. Beside her, 19-year-old Elsa Richter from Berlin tried to maintain the composure expected of a German woman in service to the Reich, but her hands trembled slightly as the truck bounced along the damaged roads. What could these American soldiers possibly want with them? Before we discover what happened when these German women came face to face with their captors, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The journey had begun in confusion and exhaustion. When Allied forces had surrounded their position, the women had expected the worst. Everything they had been told about American soldiers painted them as brutal, savage men who showed no mercy to their enemies. The propaganda films shown during their training had depicted Americans as cruel oppressors, as gangsters in uniform who would stop at nothing to destroy German culture and dignity. Yet something about their actual capture had not matched those stories. The American soldiers who had processed them had been efficient, but not cruel. They had been separated from male prisoners immediately, which had seemed strange. One of the soldiers, a tall man with red hair and freckles, had even offered Margarete water when she had stumbled during the march to the holding area. She had been too frightened to accept, expecting some kind of trap or mockery. Now, as the convoy continued its journey, the women tried to prepare themselves mentally for what awaited them. They exchanged worried glances but spoke little, knowing that their captors might understand German. Elsa found herself watching the American guards who rode in the truck with them. They seemed impossibly large, these men from across the Atlantic. Even sitting casually with their rifles resting against their shoulders, they appeared to tower over the German women. Their uniforms were different too, somehow cleaner and better fitted than the Wehrmacht uniforms she had grown accustomed to seeing. One of the guards caught her staring and smiled slightly. Elsa quickly looked away, her heart pounding, uncertain what that expression meant. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. From the moment Margarete and her fellow auxiliaries had begun their service training, they had been shown carefully edited films and photographs designed to shape their understanding of the American enemy. The Americans were portrayed as uncultured brutes, descendants of criminals and outcasts who had fled Europe. They were mongrels, the instructors had said, a mixed race of inferior peoples who lacked the discipline and honor of true soldiers. The training officer at Margarete's communication school had been particularly emphatic about what to expect if captured. American soldiers respect nothing, he had told the young women assembled before him. They come from a nation built on greed and violence. They will treat you as objects, not as soldiers serving your country with honor. Elsa remembered a specific propaganda poster that had hung in her barracks in Berlin. It showed a grotesque caricature of an American soldier, drawn with exaggerated features, looming over a cowering German family. The caption read, "This is what awaits if we lose." She had looked at that poster every day for months, letting its message sink deep into her consciousness. Now, sitting in the back of the American truck, she tried to reconcile those images with the actual men guarding them. These soldiers did not look like the monsters from the posters. They looked tired, yes, and battle-worn, but there was something fundamentally different about them that she could not quite identify. One of them was reading a letter, his lips moving slightly as he read words from home. Another was sharing something from a small tin with his companion, both of them chewing contentedly. They seemed almost relaxed, which struck Elsa as deeply strange. The German soldiers she had known were always rigid, always conscious of maintaining proper military bearing. These Americans seemed comfortable in their own skin in a way she had never witnessed before. Margarete noticed something else that contradicted the propaganda. The diversity among the guards was startling. She could see men who appeared to be of different backgrounds, different complexions, serving together without the rigid hierarchy she had been taught was necessary for military effectiveness. One guard had distinctly Asian features, another appeared to be of darker complexion, yet they worked alongside fair-skinned soldiers as equals. This was supposed to be a weakness, according to her training. A mongrel army cannot be effective, her instructors had insisted. Unity requires purity. Yet here was evidence that perhaps that teaching had been wrong. The truck hit a rough patch of road, causing everyone to jostle against each other. One of the American guards reached out instinctively to steady a German woman who had nearly fallen from her seat. The gesture was automatic, protective rather than aggressive. The woman, a 30-year-old nurse named Hilda, looked at him with wide, surprised eyes. The convoy slowed as it approached what appeared to be a makeshift processing center somewhere in northeastern France. Through the canvas opening at the back of the truck, Margarete caught her first clear view of American soldiers going about their daily routines. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. They were enormous. Not all of them, but enough that it created an overwhelming impression of sheer physical size that German propaganda had never adequately conveyed. The films had shown Americans as brutish and crude, but they had not prepared her for the reality of men who seemed to have been fed well their entire lives, who stood head and shoulders above the average German soldier she had encountered. A group of American soldiers was unloading supplies from another truck nearby. Their movements were efficient and casual, and Margarete found herself unconsciously comparing them to the German soldiers she had worked alongside for 2 years. The Americans seemed broader through the shoulders, their arms thick with muscle earned from physical labor. Even their posture was different, more open and relaxed than the rigid military bearing demanded of Wehrmacht personnel. Elsa whispered to Margarete in German, barely audible. "They look like they have never known hunger." It was true. While German rations had been steadily decreasing over the past year, leaving soldiers and auxiliaries alike looking increasingly gaunt, these American men appeared well-nourished, their faces full rather than hollow. Some of them were actually joking with each other as they worked, their laughter carrying across the compound. Laughter. In a military setting, Margarete had rarely heard such sounds among German troops, especially not in the past year as the war had turned increasingly desperate. The truck came to a complete stop, and an American officer approached. He was perhaps the largest man Margarete had ever seen, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. He spoke to the driver in English, his voice deep but not unkind, then turned to look at the German women in the back of the truck. His gaze swept over them, and Margarete saw something in his expression that confused her. It was not hatred or contempt. It looked almost like concern. The officer said something in English to the guards, who nodded and began helping the women down from the truck. Margarete hesitated when one of the guards extended his hand to assist her. His hand was massive, rough with calluses, and she found herself frozen between her training that told her to refuse any contact with the enemy and the practical reality that the jump from the truck was considerable, and she was exhausted. The guard waited patiently, his hand still extended, his expression neutral. Finally, Margarete accepted his help. His grip was firm but gentle, and he steadied her as her feet touched the ground. She noticed that his hands, though large and work-roughened, were scrupulously clean. Even in the midst of war, these Americans maintained a level of hygiene that seemed almost obsessive compared to what she had grown accustomed to. As the 37 German women were assembled in a line for processing, Margarete had her first opportunity to truly observe the American soldiers who would be their captors. What struck her most profoundly was not their size, though that remained impressive, but rather the expressions on their faces. These were not the faces of conquerors reveling in their victory over defeated enemies. Instead, she saw curiosity, uncertainty, and in some cases what appeared to be genuine awkwardness about how to handle a group of female prisoners. A young American soldier, perhaps no more than 20 years old, stood nearby with his rifle slung over his shoulder. He had sandy blonde hair and a face full of freckles that made him look younger than he probably was. When his eyes met Margarete's, he quickly looked away, a flush of color rising in his cheeks. He appeared embarrassed, as though he had been caught staring at something he should not have been looking at. This was not the behavior of a brutal enemy soldier. This was the behavior of a young man who had perhaps never been this close to women from an enemy nation and did not quite know how to conduct himself. Elsa noticed a different guard. An older man with graying hair at his temples and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He was speaking quietly to one of the younger guards, and though she could not understand the English words, his tone seemed instructive, almost fatherly. He gestured toward the German women with a motion that seemed to indicate they should be treated with care. Again, this contradicted everything the propaganda had taught them. The processing officer who approached them was a woman, which surprised all of them. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan was perhaps 35 years old, trim and professional in her uniform, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation style. She addressed them in heavily accented but understandable German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," she said clearly. "You will be fed, housed, and given medical attention as needed. You will be expected to follow camp regulations, but you will not be mistreated." Margarete exchanged glances with several other women. The presence of a female officer was something none of them had anticipated. In the German military, women served in auxiliary roles, but never in positions of direct authority over troops. Yet, here was an American woman in uniform, speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and the male soldiers around her treated her authority as completely natural. Lieutenant Brennan continued speaking, explaining basic rules and expectations, but Marguerite found herself distracted by observing the interactions between the American soldiers. She watched as a tall African-American soldier passed by carrying a crate of supplies. The white soldiers he passed greeted him casually, one of them making what appeared to be a joke that caused the black soldier to laugh and respond in kind. They treated each other as brothers in arms. This too had been presented as impossible in German propaganda. The instructors had insisted that America's racial mixing would be its downfall, that such a force could never be cohesive or effective. Yet what Marguerite was witnessing suggested otherwise. The German women were led to a holding area, a large tent that had been set up specifically for their temporary housing. Inside, cots were arranged in neat rows, and each woman was given a thin blanket and a small care package containing basic toiletries. The items were simple but clean, and Margarete noticed that the soap smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that reminded her painfully of home. As evening approached, the women gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed German, processing what they had witnessed so far. 24-year-old Frieda Vogel, a former telegraph operator from Hamburg, voiced what many of them were thinking. "They are not what we were told to expect," she said quietly. "I keep waiting for the cruelty to begin, but instead they give us soap and blankets." Hilda, the nurse who had nearly fallen in the truck, nodded slowly. "The guard who steadied me today," he apologized afterward, in German. "He knew exactly one word in our language, and he used it to say he was sorry for touching me without permission." The implications of this settled over the group like a weight. These were not the monsters from the propaganda films. These were young men, many of them probably drafted into service just as the German women had volunteered, now trying to navigate the uncomfortable reality of holding female prisoners. That night, sleep came uneasily for most of them. Margarete lay on her cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, trying to reconcile everything she had believed with everything she had witnessed. The photograph of her brother Klaus was tucked under her thin pillow, and she found herself wondering if he had encountered American soldiers on the Western Front, if he too had discovered that the enemy looked different up close than they did in the propaganda posters. The next morning brought their first real attempt at communication across the language barrier. A young American soldier, a private whose name tag read Morrison, was assigned to help distribute breakfast rations. He approached their tent with obvious nervousness, carrying a large container of what appeared to be oatmeal and a basket of bread. His German was non-existent, but he tried anyway, using hand gestures and simplified English to indicate that the food was for them. Elsa, who had studied some English in school before the war, hesitantly tried to speak. "Thank you," she managed in heavily accented English. The words felt strange in her mouth, like a betrayal of everything she had been taught about maintaining distance from the enemy. Private Morrison's face lit up with surprised relief. "You speak English?" he asked hopefully, his words coming slowly and clearly as though speaking to a child. Elsa shook her head. "Little. Very little." She held up her thumb and forefinger pinched close together to demonstrate. But it was enough. Private Morrison set down the food container and pulled out a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He drew a simple picture of a cup and pointed to it questioningly. "Coffee? Tea?" he asked. Several of the women nodded eagerly. Coffee had become a rare luxury in Germany over the past 2 years, and the prospect of having some now, even as prisoners, seemed almost surreal. Private Morrison returned 20 minutes later with a large pot of coffee and an assortment of tin cups. The coffee was real, not the ersatz chicory mixture that had become standard in Germany. The rich aroma filled the tent, and for a moment, several of the women closed their eyes, transported back to better times before rationing had stripped away such simple luxuries. As Morrison poured coffee for each woman, Marguerite watched his hands. They were large and work-roughened, with calluses that spoke of farm labor long before military service. Yet he poured with surprising care, making sure not to spill on anyone, pausing to ensure each cup was filled to a reasonable level. When he reached Marguerite, he noticed her looking at the photograph of Klaus that she had been holding. Morrison paused, gesturing to the photo with a questioning expression. Marguerite hesitated, then said quietly in German, "Mein Bruder, my brother." Morrison's face softened with understanding. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased from being carried close to his body. It showed a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18, with dark hair and a bright smile. "Sister," Morrison said, pointing to the photo. "Sarah, back in Iowa." In that moment, something shifted. Here were two people who should have been nothing but enemies to each other, finding common ground in the universal experience of loving someone far away and hoping they were safe. Morrison carefully returned his sister's photograph to his pocket, then did something that surprised everyone watching. He pulled out a chocolate bar from his ration pack, broke it into pieces, and distributed small portions to each of the German women. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Some of the younger women actually had tears in their eyes. Frida whispered to Margarete, "Why would he share his rations with us? We are his prisoners, his enemies." But Morrison seemed to see something other than enemies. Perhaps he saw women roughly the same age as his sister Sarah back in Iowa, women who were tired and scared and far from home. His kindness was not strategic or calculated. It appeared to be simply human decency expressing itself in the only way available to him. Over the following days, more small acts of unexpected kindness accumulated. Sergeant William Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, noticed that Elsa had developed a persistent cough from the cold September nights. Without being asked, he brought an extra blanket and a tin of throat lozenges. His gesture was matter-of-fact, as though caring for prisoners was simply part of his duty rather than something extraordinary. A medic named Thompson checked on Hildy's ankle after noticing she was limping slightly. He spoke no German, but he communicated through gentle examination and clear gestures, wrapping her ankle with professional care and providing her with aspirin for the pain. His hands, like Morrison's, were large but surprisingly gentle, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated many injuries but still cared about each patient individually. These accumulating kindnesses began to create a kind of cognitive dissonance among the German women. Everything they had been taught insisted that Americans would be cruel, that they would take pleasure in the suffering of their defeated enemies. Yet the reality was something entirely different. By the end of their first week in American custody, The German women had begun to make unconscious comparisons between their captors and the German soldiers they had served alongside. The contrasts were subtle but increasingly impossible to ignore. Marguerite found herself thinking often of Hauptmann Steiner, the officer who had commanded her communications unit. He had been a true believer in the Reich, rigid and uncompromising, demanding absolute precision in everything. His leadership style had been built on fear and strict hierarchy. Questioning orders was unthinkable. Personal comfort was considered weakness. Emotion was a flaw to be suppressed. The American officers, she observed, operated differently. Lieutenant Brennan, the female officer who had first processed them, moved through the camp with confidence, but without the harsh edge that characterized German officers. Marguerite watched as Brennan stopped to speak with Private Morrison one morning, and the exchange was remarkable in its informality. Morrison actually smiled while receiving instructions, nodded with understanding rather than rigid acknowledgement, and asked what appeared to be a clarifying question. Brennan answered patiently, even making what looked like a small joke that caused Morrison to chuckle. The interaction would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. An enlisted soldier casually conversing with an officer, laughing during duty hours, these things simply did not happen in the German military structure that Marguerite had known. Yet the American unit seemed to function smoothly despite, or perhaps because of, this more relaxed approach. Elsa made her own observations about the physical condition of the American soldiers. The men in her communications unit back in Germany had been growing progressively thinner over the past year. Rations had been cut repeatedly. Many soldiers had that hollow-eyed look that came from sustained inadequate nutrition. Their uniforms had become increasingly threadbare, with shortages meaning that repairs were done with whatever materials were available. The Americans, by contrast, appeared almost shockingly healthy. Their uniforms, while worn from use, were intact and properly fitted. Their faces were full rather than gaunt. During mealtimes, she watched them eat with the unconscious ease of people who had never really known hunger, who had never wondered if there would be enough food tomorrow. Even their skin looked different, she realized. Healthier, less sallow. Frida, who had worked in administrative offices, coordinating supply logistics, understood perhaps better than the others what these physical differences meant. The Americans had supply lines that actually worked. They had an industrial capacity that could feed and equip their soldiers properly. She had seen the German supply situation deteriorating steadily over the past 2 years, had processed requisition after requisition that could not be filled because the materials simply did not exist. Looking at the American camp, with its abundance of equipment, food, and medical supplies, she began to understand something that the propaganda had never admitted. Germany was not losing the war because of some moral failing or lack of will. Germany was losing because it had been overwhelmed by an enemy with vastly superior resources. Hilda noticed differences in how injuries and illness were treated. In German medical facilities, supplies had been rationed carefully. Morphine was saved for only the most extreme cases. Bandages were reused when possible. It was a small thing, almost trivial in the context of war and captivity, but it struck Marguerite with unexpected force on their 10th day in American custody. She was walking across the compound, escorted by a guard she had come to recognize as Corporal Davis, when they passed a group of American soldiers taking a brief rest break. One of them had received a package from home and was sharing its contents with his companions. Cookies. Someone's mother had sent cookies. The soldiers were laughing, genuinely laughing, their faces lit with simple joy over this small taste of home. The sound of their laughter carried across the compound, unrestrained and natural. Marguerite stopped walking, causing Corporal Davis to pause and look at her with concern. She realized, in that moment, that she could not remember the last time she had heard German soldiers laugh like that. Not the bitter, sardonic humor that had become common as the war dragged on, but genuine, uncomplicated joy. Davis followed her gaze and seemed to understand something of what she was thinking. He smiled himself, a warm expression that reached his eyes, and said something in English that she did not understand. but she understood his tone. It was gentle, almost apologetic, as though he recognized that she was experiencing something difficult and wished he could make it easier. That evening, Elsa shared her own observation with the group of women gathered in their tent. "Have you noticed how often they smile?" she asked. "Not just laugh, but actually smile. Even when they are working, even when they are tired, they smile at each other." Anna Becker, a 26-year-old supply clerk from Dresden, nodded slowly. "At first I thought they were mocking us," she admitted. "I kept waiting for the smiles to turn cruel, but they never do. They smile because they are actually happy, or at least content." I had forgotten that was possible. The realization was unsettling because it forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans, despite being at war, despite being far from home, despite facing the same uncertainties about the future, seemed to maintain a fundamental optimism that had been absent from German military culture long before the tide of war had turned against them. Margarete thought about the faces she had seen in her communications unit over the past 2 years. Grim determination, yes. Rigid discipline, certainly. But joy, contentment? These had been in short supply even when Germany was winning battles. The Reich had demanded sacrifice and suffering as proof of dedication. Comfort was considered softness. But these Americans seemed to find moments of happiness despite the war. They wrote letters home and actually smiled while writing them. They shared packages from families who clearly sent them with love. They joked with each other during work details, making even tedious tasks more bearable through camaraderie. Private Morrison, who had become something of a regular presence around their tent through his various duties, embodied this spirit particularly well. He would whistle while working, actual cheerful melodies that seemed completely incongruous with being in a military camp. Once, when Margarete had commented on this in her halting English, he had simply grinned and said, "Mama always said, whistling keeps the darkness away." The transition happened so gradually that no one could identify exactly when it began, but by the 3rd week of October, the German women were eating meals in the same dining facility as some of the American soldiers. The arrangement had started out of practical necessity. The temporary camp lacked separate facilities, but it evolved into something more significant than simple logistics. The first shared meal had been tense. The 37 German women sat clustered at one end of the long tables, speaking only to each other in hushed German, while American soldiers occupied the other end, casting curious glances but maintaining respectful distance. Margarete remembered holding her fork with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware of being surrounded by men she had been conditioned to view as dangerous enemies. But then Private Morrison had walked past carrying his own meal tray and paused at their table. He gestured to an empty seat near Elsa and spoke a single questioning word in English. "Okay?" It was such a simple request. "May I sit here?" Elsa looked at Margarete, then at the other women, uncertainty written across all their faces. Finally, she nodded, and Morrison sat down with clear relief, as though he had been worried about causing offense. He ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, then pulled out his small notebook, the same one he had used before, to draw pictures for communication. This time he drew a simple farm, complete with a barn and what appeared to be cows. He pointed to himself, then to the drawing. Margarete understood. This was his home, his life before the war. She found herself leaning forward with interest, despite her lingering caution. Morrison continued drawing, adding stick figures that must have represented his family. He pointed to each one, saying names. Papa. Mama. Sarah. He pointed to one figure. Brother Tom. Another figure. Sister Mary. A third. The simple act of sharing these details, of making himself human and individual rather than just another anonymous enemy soldier, created a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Frida, emboldened by Morrison's openness, gestured for his notebook and pencil. She drew her own simple sketch, a city skyline that was meant to represent Hamburg. She pointed to herself, then to the drawing, mimicking Morrison's earlier gesture. Her hands moved to show buildings, then she made a falling motion with her hands, and a sound effect that approximated bombing. Her face grew somber, and the message was clear. Her city had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Morrison's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine regret. He put his hand over his heart and said something in English that Marguerite did not understand, but the tone was apologetic, sorrowful. He had not been part of those bombing raids, but he seemed to feel the weight of collective responsibility nonetheless. This exchange opened something that had been carefully sealed. Over the following days, more American soldiers began sitting near the German women during meals. The initial wariness on both sides gradually softened into cautious curiosity. Sergeant Chen, who had brought Elsa the blanket when she was ill, began using mealtimes as impromptu English lessons, pointing to various foods and saying their English names, then encouraging the women to repeat them. "Bread," he would say clearly, holding up a slice. The International Red Cross had established male privileges for prisoners of war, and in late October, the German women were informed they could write letters home. The news created a complicated mixture of relief and anxiety among them. They desperately wanted to let their families know they were alive and unharmed, but they quickly discovered that writing honestly about their experiences was nearly impossible. Marguerite sat with a blank sheet of paper for nearly an hour before managing to write anything at all. How could she tell her mother and father that their captors were kind? How could she explain that the Americans they had been taught to fear as monsters were actually treating them better than some German officers had? Any such admission would be seen as collaboration, as betrayal, or worse, as evidence that she had been broken by enemy propaganda. She finally wrote in careful, measured words, "Dear Mama and Papa, I am being held in an American prisoner facility in France. I am unharmed and in good health. The conditions are adequate and we are being treated according to international law. Please do not worry about me. I think of you and Klaus every day and pray for your safety. Your daughter, Margarete." It was all true, yet it told her parents nothing of what she was actually experiencing. The word adequate seemed particularly dishonest. The food was better than what she had eaten in her own unit for the past year. The medical care was thorough and professional. The Americans had even provided them with clean undergarments and basic toiletries, small dignities that the increasingly desperate German supply system had struggled to provide. Elsa faced a similar dilemma as she attempted her own letter. She wanted to tell her sister Maria about Private Morrison and his simple kindness, about Sergeant Chen's patient English lessons, about the way the American soldiers smiled and laughed, even in the midst of war. But such details would sound like collaboration, like she had forgotten her duty to the fatherland. Instead, she wrote neutrally about the weather, about being in good health, about hoping the war would end soon so they could be reunited. She signed her letter and felt like she had told a lie through omission. Frida took a different approach. She was a naturally truthful person who found deception difficult even when necessary. Her letter home attempted to walk a careful line between honesty and discretion. "The American soldiers are not what we were told to expect," she wrote. "They are young men, much like our own, caught in circumstances beyond their control. I am being treated with respect and dignity." Later that evening, the women gathered to discuss what they had written. The conversation revealed that they were all struggling with the same problem. The truth of their experience did not match the narrative they had been given about America and Americans, but admitting that truth felt dangerous. Anna spoke what many of them were thinking. "If I tell my parents that the Americans have been kind, they will think I have been brainwashed. If I tell them nothing, they will imagine the worst and suffer needlessly. There is no good answer." The shift happened so gradually that Marguerite could not identify the exact moment when her perception changed, but by early November, the physical size of the American soldiers no longer frightened her. Instead, it had begun to represent something entirely different: safety. It started one cold morning when a truck backfired loudly near the women's tent. The sound was sharp and explosive, identical to gunfire, and Marguerite's body reacted instinctively. She dropped to the ground, her heart racing, memories of artillery fire flooding back. Within seconds, Corporal Davis was there, his large frame blocking her view of the truck, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said clearly in his simple English, "just truck, no danger." His physical presence, which would have terrified her a month earlier, now felt protective rather than threatening. He waited patiently while her breathing slowed, not rushing her, not mocking her fear. When she finally stood up, embarrassed by her reaction, he simply nodded with understanding and walked beside her for the rest of the morning, a silent guardian, ensuring she felt secure. Elsa experienced her own moment of recognition a few days later. A group of drunk French civilians had wandered near the camp perimeter, shouting insults at the German women they could see through the fence. The words were in French, but the hatred in their voices was unmistakable. Elsa had frozen, understanding that these civilians had every reason to despise German soldiers after years of occupation. Before the situation could escalate, Sergeant Chen and two other American soldiers positioned themselves between the German women and the fence. Their stance was relaxed, but unmistakably protective. Chen spoke to the French civilians in what sounded like passable French, his tone firm but not aggressive. After a brief conversation, the civilians left, still angry but no longer threatening. Chen turned to check on the German women, his expression concerned. "You are under American protection," he said in careful English, making sure they understood. "No one will harm you here." The words carried weight. These large American soldiers, who could have easily used their physical strength to intimidate or harm their prisoners, had instead chosen to use it to protect them. From that day forward, Elsa found herself unconsciously moving closer to the American guards when she felt uncertain or unsafe, rather than away from them. Frida observed how the other women were responding similarly. During meals, they no longer positioned themselves as far from the American soldiers as possible. Instead, they gravitated toward the familiar guards, particularly Morrison, Chen, and Davis, whose presence had become associated with kindness and security. The same physical attributes that had initially seemed threatening, the broad shoulders, the towering height, the powerful builds, now represented protection. Anna put it into words one evening. "I used to think their size made them dangerous," she said quietly. "Now I realize their size means they can keep us safe." It is strange how the same thing can look so different, depending on what you understand about the person. It was perhaps the most profound shift in their perception. These men were not monsters, they were guardians. Private James Morrison had become something of an unexpected bridge between two worlds. At 22 years old, he possessed an earnest quality that reminded many of the German women of their own brothers, sons, or younger cousins who had been swept up in the war. His freckled face and genuine smile made him seem almost too young for the uniform he wore, despite having already survived the Normandy invasion and months of combat across France. Marguerite found herself watching Morrison one afternoon as he attempted to teach a group of younger German women a card game. His German vocabulary consisted of perhaps 20 words, and their English was only slightly better, but somehow they managed to communicate through gestures, laughter, and the universal language of play. When one of the women, 18-year-old Greta, made a mistake in the game, Morrison simply smiled and helped her correct it, his patience as natural as breathing. It struck Marguerite that this was exactly how her brother Klaus would have behaved. Klaus had always been kind to her friends, always willing to explain things without condescension, always able to make people feel comfortable. The resemblance was not physical. Klaus had dark hair and brown eyes while Morrison was fair and blue-eyed, but the similarity in temperament was unmistakable. Elsa had her own connection to Morrison that deepened one evening when he showed her a letter from his sister, Sarah. He could not read it aloud to her because of the language barrier, but he showed her a photograph that Sarah had included. It depicted a young woman standing next to a dairy cow, her expression proud and happy. Morrison made milking gestures and pointed to himself, indicating this was part of his farm life back home. Elsa pulled out her own precious photograph, carefully preserved despite her capture. It showed her younger brother Franz in his Luftwaffe uniform, taken just before he had been sent to the Eastern Front. She had not heard from Franz in over 8 months and did not know if he was alive or dead. Morrison looked at the photograph with visible sympathy, understanding immediately what the image represented. He pointed to Franz, then to himself, making a gesture that seemed to indicate they were the same, just young men caught in a war neither had started. Then he did something that brought tears to Elsa's eyes. He carefully folded his hands and bowed his head briefly, a simple gesture of prayer. He was praying for Franz, for a German soldier he had never met, because he understood what it meant to have a sibling in danger. The other American soldiers noticed Morrison's easy rapport with the German women and began to emulate his approach. They stopped seeing the women as abstract enemies and started seeing them as individuals, as sisters and daughters who happened to be wearing the wrong uniform. Corporal Davis began bringing his own photographs to share, pictures of his family in Pennsylvania. Sergeant Chen talked about his parents' immigration story, drawing parallels to the women's own feelings of displacement. These personal exchanges created bonds that transcended nationality and allegiance. The German women found themselves thinking of these American soldiers not as conquerors or captors, but as the brothers they might have had in another life. By mid-November, Elsa's English had improved enough for actual conversations rather than simple exchanges of words. What began as vocabulary practice evolved into discussions that challenged everything the German women had been taught about America and its people. She was helping Sergeant Chen organize supplies one afternoon when he asked her a question that seemed simple but carried profound implications. "Why did you join the Wehrmacht Auxiliary?" he asked, his English clear and patient. Elsa paused, considering how to answer. "I believed I was defending my country," she said carefully. "We were told Germany was surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy us, that we had no choice but to fight." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And now? What do you believe now?" It was the question Elsa had been avoiding asking herself. "Now I do not know what to believe," she admitted. "Everything I was told about Americans was wrong. You were supposed to be cruel, uncivilized, interested only in destroying German culture. But you brought me a blanket when I was cold. You teach me English with patience. You treat me like a human being, not like an enemy." Chen was quiet for a moment, then shared his own story. His parents had immigrated from China, facing discrimination and hardship in America. But they had also found opportunity and eventually acceptance. "America is not perfect," he said honestly, "but it allows people to become more than what others expect them to be. That is something worth defending." These conversations spread as more women gained confidence in their English. Private Morrison talked with Margarete about his family's farm, about how his father had opposed the war initially, believing America should stay out of European conflicts. "But then we learned about the camps," Morrison said, his expression growing somber. "About what was happening to Jewish people, to prisoners, to anyone the Nazis decided was inferior. My father said, 'Some things are worth fighting against, even if you wish you didn't have to.'" Marguerite felt ice in her stomach. She had heard whispers about camps, about atrocities, but had dismissed them as enemy propaganda. The certainty in Morrison's voice, the sadness in his eyes, suggested he was telling the truth. "What camps?" she asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. Morrison looked at her carefully, seeming to choose his words with care. "Concentration camps, places where people were sent to die because of their religion or ethnicity or political beliefs. We have been liberating them as we advance through Europe." He paused. "You really did not know?" Margarete shook her head, feeling dizzy. "We were told nothing like that. We were told we were defending civilization, protecting European culture." The conversation left her shaken. That evening, she shared what Morrison had told her with the other women. Some refused to believe it, insisting it must be American propaganda designed to demoralize them. But others, like Frida and Anna, admitted they had heard similar rumors, whispers that had been quickly suppressed. Hilda, the nurse, spoke quietly. "I treated wounded soldiers from the East," she said. "Some of them said things about what they had seen, about orders they had been given. I did not want to believe them. I told myself they were traumatized, confused. But what if they were telling the truth? The revelations about the camps created a crisis of identity among the German women. Everything they had believed about serving their country honorably was now cast in a different, darker light. Yet even as they grappled with this disturbing knowledge, they found themselves surrounded by daily examples of humanity from the very people they had been taught were their enemies. Lieutenant Brennan noticed the shift in the women's demeanor and arranged for a gathering where they could ask questions freely. She brought with her newspapers and photographs from liberated camps, not to punish or shame, but to help them understand the reality of what their country had done. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Margarete sat with trembling hands, looking at photographs that showed horrors she could not have imagined. Beside her, Elsa wept openly. Anna covered her mouth, fighting nausea. These were not propaganda images designed to manipulate. These were documentation of systematic evil carried out in their country's name. "We did not know," Frida said, her voice broken. "How could we not have known?" Lieutenant Brennan's response was measured and compassionate. "Many Germans did not know the full extent," she said. "The regime was built on secrecy and lies. But now you do know. The question is, what you will do with that knowledge." That evening, Private Morrison found Margarete sitting alone outside the tent, her face streaked with tears. He sat down nearby, not too close, respecting her space but offering his presence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Margarete turned to him, her eyes red from crying. "How can you be kind to us?" she asked in halting English. "After seeing those places, knowing what our country did, how can you still treat us like human beings?" Morrison considered his answer carefully, understanding the weight of the question she was asking. "Because you are not responsible for things you did not do and did not know about," he said slowly. "My mama always taught me that every person has to be judged by their own actions, not by what others do. You have been respectful, honest, trying to learn and grow. That is what I see when I look at you." His words broke something open inside Margarete. "I wore the uniform," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I served that regime. Even if I did not know everything, I was part of it." Morrison nodded with understanding. "Yes, you were, and now you know the truth, and you are horrified by it. That matters. What you choose to do from this moment forward, that matters too." Sergeant Chen offered similar wisdom to other women struggling with their guilt and shame. "You cannot change the past," he told Elsa during one of their conversations. "But you can choose what kind of person you become now. That choice is always yours to make." Over the following days, the German women found themselves looking at their American captors with new understanding. These men had every reason to hate them, to treat them harshly, to take revenge for the horrors their countrymen had discovered across Europe. Yet, they chose differently. December arrived with cold rain that turned the camp into a landscape of mud and gray skies. The weather matched the somber mood that had settled over the German women as they processed the revelations about their country's crimes. Yet even in this darkness, something remarkable was happening. The barriers between captor and captive were dissolving in ways that would have seemed impossible just 3 months earlier. Christmas preparations began in early December, and Lieutenant Brennan made an unexpected announcement. The German women would be allowed to celebrate the holiday in their own way, and any American soldiers who wished to join them were welcome to do so. The gesture was more significant than it might have appeared. Margarete worked with several other women to create simple decorations from whatever materials they could find. Paper chains made from supply requisition forms, stars cut from tin cans, evergreen branches gathered from nearby trees. The modest decorations transformed their tent into something that felt almost like home. On Christmas Eve, Private Morrison appeared with an unexpected gift. He had somehow acquired a small pine tree, barely 3 feet tall, which he presented to the women with his characteristic shy smile. "For Christmas," he said simply, "everyone should have a tree." The women decorated it together, Americans and Germans working side by side, and in that moment, Elsa realized something profound. She was no longer afraid of these men. More than that, she no longer thought of them as enemies at all. They were simply people, individuals with names and families and kindnesses who happened to wear a different uniform. That evening, they sang together. The German women taught the Americans Stille Nacht, and the Americans taught them Silent Night, and they discovered they were singing the same song in different languages. Margarete watched as Morrison struggled with the German pronunciation, his face scrunched in concentration, and she found herself laughing. Not the nervous, uncertain laughter of captivity, but genuine amusement born of comfort and familiarity. Sergeant Chen had brought his harmonica and played softly while they sang. Corporal Davis shared cookies his wife had sent from Pennsylvania. Lieutenant Brennan told stories about Christmas on her family's farm in Vermont. The German women reciprocated with their own memories of holidays before the war, of simpler times when the future had seemed bright and certain. Anna sat next to a young American soldier named Phillips, who had lost his brother at Normandy. They did not share much language, but they shared grief, and somehow that was enough. When Philip showed her a photograph of his brother, Anna showed him a letter from her cousin who had died on the Eastern Front. They sat together in companionable sorrow, two people who had lost family members to the same war, finding common ground in their shared loss. As midnight approached, Frida looked around at the assembled group and whispered to Marguerite, "When did it happen? When did we stop being enemies?" Marguerite shook her head. "I do not know. Perhaps it happened gradually, in all the small moments of kindness. Or perhaps we were never truly enemies at all, just people who were told we should be." The realization settled over the group like snow. They had begun this journey seeing each other as dangerous others, as representatives of opposing sides in a vast conflict. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but for the 37 German women who had been captured the previous September, the true transformation had already occurred. The giants who had once terrified them had become the people who taught them that enemies could become friends, that first impressions could be utterly wrong, and that humanity could survive even the darkest chapters of history. Marguerite stood with Lieutenant Brennan on the day repatriation was announced, facing a choice she had never imagined she would have to make. Return to a Germany that no longer existed as she had known it, or attempt to build a new life in America. The decision was complicated by everything she had learned, everything she had experienced, everything she had become during her months in American captivity. "What will you do?" Brennan asked gently. Marguerite thought of Private Morrison and his simple kindness, of Sergeant Chen and his patient teaching, of Corporal Davis and his quiet protection. She thought of how terrified she had been that first day, seeing these enormous American soldiers and believing she faced certain cruelty. She thought of how wrong she had been. "I do not know," she admitted, "but I know I am not the same person who arrived here in September." That woman believed what she was told without questioning. This woman knows better. Elsa made her decision more quickly. She would return to Germany, but not as a defeated prisoner returning in shame. She would return as someone who had learned that former enemies could show more compassion than friends, that size and strength could be used for protection rather than domination, and that the human capacity for kindness could overcome even the deepest divisions. "I need to tell others what I learned here," she told Margarete. "Germans need to know that Americans are not what we were told, that reconciliation is possible, that we can become better than we were." In the years that followed, the women who had been held in that temporary camp in France would tell their stories to children and grandchildren. They would speak of the moment they first saw American soldiers and thought they were giants. They would describe their terror, their confusion, and their gradual realization that everything they had been taught was wrong. Marguerite eventually settled in Iowa, not far from Morrison's family farm. She became a teacher, specializing in helping immigrant children learn English, drawing on her own experience of language as a bridge between cultures. She kept the photograph of her brother Klaus, who had survived the war, and next to it she placed a photograph of Morrison and his family, the Americans who had shown her what kindness looked like. Anna married an American soldier and raised children who grew up hearing stories about how their mother had once been terrified of their father's countrymen, how she had learned that first impressions can be transformed by human decency, and how even in war, individuals can choose compassion over cruelty. The legacy of those 37 German women and the American soldiers who guarded them became a testament to a simple truth. People are not defined by the propaganda that describes them or the uniforms they wear, but by the choices they make when faced with those they have been taught to hate.